The first speaker is uh, somebody that I met first about 12 years ago or so when I was reviewing his book on mind shaping. And he was kind enough to invite me to Washington to have dinner and drinks while he explained his book to me, and we discussed it over a very nice meal and had a good evening. And so now, 10, 15 years later, I'm honored to introduce Tad, who's a professor, associate professor of philosophy at George Washington University, and who will give us a presentation entitled Pattern Finding and Pattern Making.
Oh, thank you so much, John. Can everyone hear me?
I can.
Okay, hopefully you're representative. Thanks so much for inviting me to this. And again, your flexibility in accommodating my schedule. I have a chair's council meeting to go to later. Again, apologies, I'll have to duck out early. What I want to talk about today, I don't think I actually explicitly referred to normativity or mind shaping in this presentation, but I think it's highly relevant, as you'll see. So here's the background and the plan. I think the way I'm thinking about this project is as an initial stab at a cognitive neuroscience of ideology. And to get clear on what I mean by that, there'll be a bit of a whirlwind tour through intellectual history, so please bear with me. So the sort of problematic I want to intervene on is this traditional idea that the cognitive processes driving what I call pattern finding and pattern making are radically disjoint. It corresponds roughly to the distinction between beliefs on the one hand that have a pattern finding function and desires or intentions that have a pattern making function, roughly modeled on the distinction between assertions and commands in language. What I want to call the problem of ideology roughly is this. Some of our most important pattern making relies essentially on beliefs and assertions that seem to aim at pattern finding and then go on to make themselves at least partially true. So on this traditional distinction in cognition, it's kind of hard to categorize ideology and ideological thought in terms of these two different cognitive processes. However, there is a recent sort of very interesting and exciting new approach to cognitive neuroscience called, variably the Bayesian brain approach or the predictive processing approach or the active inference approach. And I think it's ideally suited to accommodating ideological thought and language. So the first part of the talk, or the lion's share of the talk, I'm going to work through this. And then at the end, I want to say something about how the active inference approach to explaining individual behavior can be extended to the making of social patterns, not just individual patterns in behavior. So that's roughly the agenda. Let's begin. So this is roughly what I mean by found patterns, that paradigmatically the patterns in nature that are uncovered by natural science. Patterns that we notice when we look at evidence, the evidence of the senses, and try to uncover deep regularities that explain them. And what I mean by made patterns or pattern making, paradigmatically is human artifacts, technology, practices like dance and marching. One of the earliest made patterns known to archaeology is the Acheulean hand axe there on the top left corner. But architecture, music, and language are paradigmatic examples of made patterns. So this distinction, for a very long time in the European tradition at least, has been explained in terms of a distinction in cognition. Aristotle distinguishes between three types of knowledge: theoria, praxis, poiesis. Theoria aims at pattern finding, praxis, pattern making in human social behavior, and poiesis, pattern making in technology. And even identifies a different form of thought. behind these different kinds of practice, famously the theoretical versus the practical syllogism. And this duality has had a huge influence in the European philosophical tradition, most notably people who made it explicit in the 20th century. Very nice kind of encapsulation of the distinction in Elizabeth Anscombe's grocery list example. You can have the same list of food. In one case, it's playing a directive or pattern making role in the case of the person who's searching for food based on the list. But if you're a private detective tailing the person and trying to note what they're buying, that's pattern finding role. And Searle famously worked this up into a distinction among declarative and imperative speech acts, where you can have two speech acts with the same content, one with declarative force aiming at tracking a pattern or finding a pattern, one with imperative force aimed at making a pattern. Okay, so that's the background, and it's sort of standard cognitive science and philosophy of mind since Hume has maintained this distinction in philosophy of language and sort of use it as a model of how the mind works. So this distinction between belief modules and desire modules in classic computational models of the mind sort of encapsulates the idea of there being a separate part of cognition devoted to pattern finding, another devoted to pattern making, and only in collaboration do they lead to behavior. However, as my dissertation director from many years ago, Andy Clark, has recently argued, this model is not an accurate model of how the brain works. According to the active inference or predictive processing framework, quote, desires and motivations are fluently accommodated within the unifying PP schema, where they emerge as webs of prior beliefs that sculpt probabilistic predictions, some of which become positioned so as to bring about actions. Importantly, and here's the key idea, a single construct plays the role of belief and desire. So that's a nice summary of the active inference framework, which makes clear how it differs from this classical view according to which the cognitive processes underlying pattern making and pattern finding are disjoint. Okay, so now on to the problem of ideology. I am not an expert in this extremely rich and field of philosophical inquiry. So I just want for the purposes of this talk, to propose a sort of minimal understanding of what ideology is, and that is it's pattern making masquerading as pattern finding. So in classic discussions from these folks you see, whose pictures you see, I use the term suspicious minds from Bob Brandom, I think, at some point. Called these philosophers the philosophers of suspicion. So the basic idea is that you can promote the powerful interest by concealing true patterns with something like masking patterns that victims unwittingly work to reproduce, at least partially. So if you think of religion as an ideology, you can think of these assertions about the nature of reality. The meek shall inherit the earth. God will redeem our suffering, as motivating behavior on the part of people who believe them that partially sort of confirms these predictions, or as Foucault pointed out, these sorts of assumptions about what's natural to human beings. It's natural for men to desire women, for example, masquerading as a found pattern about human beings that partially maintains itself in virtue of being, widely promulgated. Okay, so this has had in contemporary philosophy, this basic idea has had some really rich development by Sally, for example. So Sally famously argues that a lot of politically fraught categories like race and gender are real but not natural. They're constructed. And what's interesting is Sally emphasizes that, quote, sex and race oppression are structural, institutional, but they're also internalized in our basic interpretations and understandings of our bodies, ourselves, and each other. And that's sort of what I'm trying to get at here is in what does this internalization consist? What model of neural computation might be able to account for this? uh, One reason that these sorts of patterns are incredibly persistent has been explored in the work of Kaylin O'Connor, where she deploys evolutionary game theory to explain why certain sort of ideological patterns become stable because they constitute or contribute to what she calls complementary solutions to complementary coordination problems. Uh, uh, as opposed to correlative ones. So correlative one, driving on the right, everyone does the same thing. And in a complementary coordination problem, you have people playing different roles to solve the coordination problem, as in dances like the Paso Doble. So she applies this to gender norms and looks, for example, at gendered solutions to household division of labor problems. And argues that if you model these using evolutionary game theoretic simulations, it shows that asymmetric role solutions can be stable equilibrium strategies. What that means roughly is that not playing the disadvantaged role has greater costs than playing it. So, for example, the persistent asymmetry in the female part of the burden in domestic and the household division of labor problem is it persists because not doing it is actually makes the person worse off in these game theoretic dynamics. So O'Connor argues that this explains why these gender asymmetries are stable and remarkably robust across cultures, unfortunately. But also, she shows that she argues in this book that they're not inevitable, right? There is cultural variation. So, socio-historical and political factors explain the particular distributions that we see in particular cultures. Okay. Um, Another sort of famous concept from recent philosophy, which is sort of in this vicinity and gestures towards a cognitive explanation of this sort of phenomenon, is Hacking's notion. Another person who sadly departed our world this past year. The notion of a looping effect. So he famously argues that humankind's, and in particular psychiatric classifications, sort of are engaged in this kind of looping effect where the labeling has dynamic effects, thus dynamic nominalism, has dynamic effects on the people who are labeled. And he thinks this marks an important distinction because unlike natural objects, humans are aware that and how they're categorized. Unlike, say, a sample of iron, which gets categorized but is not aware of it, human beings are aware, and the categorization feeds back, affecting the categorized, and that triggers tweaks to the initial categorization, and you get this kind of spiral, this dynamic spiral. And, he talks about different illustrations of this, of how, the category of multiple personality gets taken up by people diagnosed in its terms and gets turned into a new category, dissociative identity, similar for these other concepts. And finally, there's some very interesting empirical evidence that shows how descriptive norms can have these sorts of looping or self-fulfilling effects. So public social scientific classifications, this is a recent paper by Uwe Peters, shows, discusses all the evidence that, and it's relevant to science communication. That's what this paper is about. The way descriptive norms are communicated to the public often leads to their own fulfillment. So a descriptive norm is something that aims to capture to track a pattern in the world or find a pattern in the world, but it ends up making patterns or reinforcing these patterns. So, for example, Californian households informed that they use more electricity than all the other households in their neighborhood, subsequently reduced their energy consumption, whereas households informed that they use less than all others increased it. So there's an interesting duality here that's similar to what I think I claim to be definitive of ideology, where something which appears to be describing a pattern actually works kind of unconsciously to reinforce the pattern and make it more stable. Okay, so how have philosophers, is there a sort of any philosophical discussion of this? Something that really stands out is Millikan's concept of a push me, pull you representation from way back in the 90s. Millikan argued that this is actually the primitive form of representation that non-human species all share, and that actually distinguishing between pattern finding and pattern making cognitive states, beliefs, and desires as a sort of later arriving thing. So she sort of anticipates this kind of approach that active inference takes now. So as she writes, what one does, what a woman does, what a teacher does, how one behaves when one is married or when one is chair of the meeting, these are grasped via thoughts, push me, pull you representations that simultaneously describe and prescribe. We don't eat peas with our fingers is another example where, you know, the grammatical surface grammar appears to be an assertive pattern finding act, but of course it has this normative dimension implied when, especially when a parent says this to a child. You see this all over in politics. Over 2 years ago now, Secretary Blinken used this assertion: when all is said and done, an independent Ukraine will be there, and at some point Vladimir Putin will not. But of course, he had very little evidence for that when he uttered it. It was more sort of aspirational, and in politics, often you will hear assertions or predictions made which clearly are also functioning to try and make themselves true or contribute at least to their self-confirmation. So that's a sort of classic push me, pull you representation. Okay, so now on to this new paradigm, a little detail about predictive processing and active inference. This is the basic Bayesian algorithm that's the kind of building block of the active inference paradigm. I'm not going to go into the details of the math because I frankly am a little foggy on it myself, but I think the bullet point here encapsulates the basic idea that the brain really has one imperative, which is to minimize the difference between old information, which is stored in its models of the world, which generate expectations, and new information, which is sensory stimulation. And active inference is the idea that there are two ways that the brain can succeed at this. Here's a recent discussion by Par Pezzullo and Friston, Friston being the sort of pioneer of this approach. Under active inference, perception and action are two complementary ways to fulfill the same imperative: minimization of free energy. What he means by free energy is something like surprise. So perception minimizes free energy by Bayesian belief updating or changing your mind, thus making your beliefs compatible with sensory observation. Instead, action minimizes free energy and surprise by changing the world to make it more compatible with your beliefs and goals. This unification of cognitive functions marks a fundamental difference between active inference and other approaches that treat action and perception in isolation from one another. So here's a diagram from that book which makes this very clear. You make a prediction about how the world will be. There's an observation, there's a discrepancy between the two, and then there are two options to minimize this discrepancy, which is what the brain aims for. You can either change the model which yielded the prediction so that next time it conforms more closely to the observation, or you can change the world. This is what happens in action, where the world, the relevant part of the world is your body. So that the action more closely next time matches the prediction. Okay, another discussion of this from Jacob Howie, one of the earliest philosophical discussions of the active inference paradigm. I'm in the interest of time, I won't read the long quote, but this is sort of a standard assumption in this new approach to, relatively new approach to cognitive neuroscience. So, the lesson I want to glean from this is that the basic idea in active inference is when it comes to explaining pattern making or action, is something I want to say call counterfactual expectation perseveration. What I mean by this is um, the idea is instead of maximizing utility relative to some extrinsic goal, agents minimize prediction error by acting to minimize the difference between proprioceptive feedback and expectation. So that's the model of action, right? So the idea is when you raise your arm, you predict that it's high up before it's high up, and there's a discrepancy between your prediction and the feedback you're getting from your arm, but somehow the discrepancy is minimized not by changing the representation of the position of your arm, but rather by adjusting your arm such that it meets the prediction. And so this raises the question, why not just adjust the expectation, right? And just say, my arm is down, not up, and just change your assumption about where your arm is as you do in most cases of discrepancy. And the answer here is that some expectations, especially those related to fundamental requirements on survival, are what we might term sticky. They don't go away even when there's a discrepancy. And the only way to minimize the discrepancy is to act, right? So a classic example from this literature is the representation of your internal body temperature. When the feedback from your body departs from this, say your temperatures goes higher, you don't adjust the expectation about the temperature your body should be. Rather, there are activities that take place to try to bring your body temperature back down to that predicted temperature. So what makes some expectations sticky? Excuse me. Here's how Andy Clark puts it. Bringing about an action requires attenuating, which means assigning a low precision to the sensory information currently indexing the actual disposition of the body so as to enable precise proprioceptive predictions corresponding to some desired trajectory to prevail. Intentional action thus depends upon a delicate balance that combines precise proprioceptive predictions with attenuated information concerning current bodily states. And here's what's interesting, I think, for the problem of ideology. An interesting consequence is that action thus depends on a kind of systematic misrepresentation of how our body is currently arrayed in space. Okay, so here's the lesson I want to draw from all this. Here's the classic pattern finding, pattern making disjunction that I mentioned earlier. Some thoughts or speech acts have what Searle calls a word-to-world direction of fit. So, for example, diet doesn't impact health. Humans act rationally. That maps onto true or false, right? Where the word is trying to respect constraints placed on it by the world. But other assertions or sort of other speech acts or thoughts have the opposite direction of fit, a word-to-word direction of fit, where the world is modified to fit the word. So men and women act thus, for example, or life has meaning. And every thought and every discursive act has to be placed in one of these two buckets on the classic view. And what's motivating my talk is that ideology is a bit hard. It's a bit hard to know which bucket to put it in because it sort of presents as a pattern finding act, but it actually functions as a pattern making act. And what's cool about active inference is it enables us to replace this classic distinction, this classic picture with the following one, where you have a kind of continuum of pattern finding and pattern making, and there are dimensions on which you can place any linguistic act or any thought Along the horizontal axis, you can think of that as a measure of stickiness. To what extent does is the expectation preserved despite a discrepancy from sensory feedback? And on the vertical axis, you have, say, rather than truth or falsity, or fulfillment or unfulfillment, you have this generic notion of prediction error. So here you might say, well, diet doesn't impact health. That's a huge prediction error. And it's also not that sticky. We're very willing to revise that. Humans act rationally is a little stickier. It's a pretty good description of human beings, but it's not a perfect description. But despite the fact that it sometimes fails to describe adequately human behavior, we hold on to it, and it ends up regulating human behavior to some a degree. Men and women act thus. This is sort of getting towards the more ideological part of the spectrum, where the prediction error is relatively high, and yet it's still very sticky. And then here's my attempt at humor. My nihilistic attempt at humor, where something that like life has meaning, it could have a lot of prediction error, and yet we can't get rid of it. It's very sticky. Okay, so that's the idea. That's why I think the active inference approach is a nice fit with ideology, because it's not like there are these two buckets where a thought or a judgment has to fall as either making patterns or finding patterns. It falls somewhere upon this continuum defined in terms of these two dimensions. And the interesting thing is that, for different people, the same judgment might fall in different parts of this spectrum. So I think this is a much better fit, because when it comes to ideology, there's, variations in how sticky the assumptions are and how much prediction error they generate. Okay, so that's now the problem here is that the active inference approach is a model of individual behavior. How does this translate into pattern making at the social level, which is where ideology is usually found? And there are some possible mechanisms of this. So one idea is the notion of identification. So often, by identifying with a group, you can look at the Brazilian soccer fans on the picture there as an example of that. By identifying with a group or with another person, one's own sort of active inferential judgments are transferred onto another person. It's a nice example for when my son Anton, was very young. We went up on this water slide, up on this rickety staircase into this platform to go down this water slide. And I have terrible vertigo. I was terrified. He didn't care. He was completely oblivious. But as he sort of approached the edge, I couldn't help but feel like danger was imminent, and I felt it in my body, presumably because I was identifying with him to such an embodied extent that I had this sort of active desire to stop him. Another example is, Strawson's notion of reactive attitudes, where we see someone violating normative expectation, and instead of adjusting our expectations such that they better track their behavior in the future, we have these emotional responses like resentment, blame, and so forth to try and modify the pattern to fit the expectation. Or there might be more basic mechanisms such as those involved in dance and marching, where there's this basic motor resonance or behavioral synchrony among multiple people. I think all of these mechanisms suggest a kind of have a sort of social niche construction function, and a concept from Evo-Devo approaches in evolutionary biology, where sometimes the adaptive response is not to modify oneself to respect a environment, but rather to modify the environment to make it a better fit with one's own expectations. And I think humans do a lot of that kind of social niche construction. So I want to locate ideology in this kind of zone. Think of them as sociocognitive tools which shape us into better sociocognitive objects and agents. There are some nascent proposals along these lines. One by my current postdoc, Rémi Tisson, who I think is in the audience, has a recent piece in philosophical psychology, where he links the active inference framework to mind shaping in roughly the way suggested here. Also, a recent Target article in I think it's Life Physics of Life Reviews by Theriot, Young, and Barrett, which uses the active inference framework to try and explain the sense of should. So I think there is some interesting work just beginning along these lines. Okay, so to conclude, I want to make a few remarks about what the implications of this picture are for human social cognition and folk psychology. Here's a relevant digression just quickly. There's a bit of a dispute within the active inference literature about what these models that the brain develops, what they're tracking. So Howie originally argues that predictive processing and Bayesian updating inevitably lead to increasingly accurate models of the causal structure, the hidden causal structure of the world, which is responsible for the sensory stimulations that yield error signals. But Andy Clark instead argues that really all the brain cares about is successful action. And so what the models need to track are affordances, not necessarily the causal structure, the hidden causal structure of the world. Affordances is a Gibsonian notion. You could see a classic Gibsonian picture of a bird in flight up on the right, where the bird is simply tracking this kind of relational or constructed property that relates it to its environment in a sort of dynamic way and enables it to guide its behavior adaptively. That's not an objective fact about the causal structure of the world. It's a relational property that relates the organism to some features in the environment. And so transposing this onto the case of social cognition, for us ultra-social humans, if we take Andy Clark's approach, what are the social affordances that our models of the social world enable us to track? Before gesturing towards an answer, I want to put on the table two challenges for applying active inference or predictive processing to social cognition. One problem is, by predictive processing's own lights, the folk psychology that predictive processing generates, our folk psychology, when applied to the social domain, is not an accurate model of the relevant causal structures. What do I mean by this? Well, the folk aren't Bayesians. The folk don't think of perception as top-down Bayesian inference of departures from expected sensory stimulations. They don't think of perception and action as aiming at the same goal. They don't think of expectations as distributions of credences and so forth. So that means, by predictive processing own lights, when applied to the social domain, predictive processing does not yield an accurate model of the relevant causal structures. Rather, it yields folk psychology. So here, at least, Howie's view seems obviously false, and Clark's view seems more applicable. We're tracking social affordances, but then that raises this question: why do human coordination problems afford folk psychological construals? And the second question is, the big problem in coordination, as has been recognized by game theorists, philosophers for a long time, is that we're trying to predict agents who are also trying to predict us at the same time. So when we apply our sort of predictive models, we have to take into account that the process is somehow also modeling us, and that seems to threaten this kind of unstable regress. So what I want to suggest is that there's a solution to both of these problems if we think of folk psychology as something I've called in print a socio-cognitive tool. The idea is that the folk psychology generated by predictive processing and applied to social domain is not a model of the causal structure of individual mind brains. Rather, it's a set of sociocognitive tools that shapes us into better sociocognitive agents and objects. We work to turn each other into better believers, desirers, willers, because this makes us easier to interpret and predict by others doing the same. So um, these are the social affordances tracked by predictive processing applied to the social domain. They're patterns we find in the social domain because they're also patterns we make. Another way, a slogan to think of this by is ideologies are these coordination devices. Okay, so one way we could extend this line of thought is, so whence are these folk psychological distinctions, like the one we began with, that don't map onto anything in the brain if you buy the active inference paradigm? For example, why did folk psychology encode a distinction between belief and desire? Well, here's a sort of sketch of an explanation. In an ultra-social species like ours, that relies on information sharing, distinguishing between essentially epistemic and pragmatic states is extremely useful. The variation in uses to which human brains put information is widespread. So communicating the precise idiosyncratic functional profile some information plays in one brain to another is unlikely to be useful and very likely to be impossible, given how fine-grained the nuances in these functions are, if we buy active inference. So we can learn from others only if we can abstract information likely to be useful for us from the detailed idiosyncratic uses to which only particular others put it. And distinguishing between purely epistemic and pragmatic dimensions of neurally implemented expectations makes this possible. So this shows how this distinction between belief and desire, though not sort of fundamental to how the brain works, can somehow shape the way brains come to work once there's a distinction in language between assertion and command. And it shows why making this distinction could be very useful, because it sort of extracts shareable content from this sort of task committed content that individual brains have. In any case, that's just a sketch in which I hope someday perhaps to take this basic picture. So I guess we can end on this. When I first gave this talk in Cork, Ireland, as I was walking to the venue, I see this massive poster, and I thought this really encapsulates the view that, belief is kind of something we do, and we can do it more or less effectively. So thank you very much.